All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar on compliance pathways. This webinar will be recorded and the recording is available to all attendees on the Code Adoption Toolkit website. If there are any issues with audio, please feel free to write me in the chat. And my name is Eric DeLello, and I'm a project manager for Noresco. This series is sponsored by the Colorado Energy Office, training materials created by Shums Coda Associates. Before we fully jump in, just want to acknowledge that there is some heavy winds outside. So if you lose hope or eye, that's probably why. So bear with us. So Hope and I have been working with the Colorado Energy Office to provide trainings just like this one. We've got a list of the next few webinars coming up, and I know Excel Energy also has a webinar series as well, so feel free to check out theirs. And there will be a link sent out in a follow-up email if you'd like to register for any of the other webinars or send it to a colleague. Feel free to do so. And then we do also offer tailored group trainings or technical assistance for jurisdictions that are updating I-codes. Most of you might know, or hopefully know, if you're attending this webinar, about the Code Adoption Toolkit and all of the resources available. But today I wanted to highlight the latest resource, which is the Code Helpline. This helpline is available to anyone in Colorado on any of the I-codes or REACH codes. So for example, if you are a jurisdiction and need assistance on a plan review, or a homeowner or engineer with a question about code applicability, you can submit a ticket and a subject matter expert like Hope will get back to you in just a couple days time. You can access the helpline through the Code Adoption Toolkit or through the link on this page, and I'll post that in the chat shortly as well. So just a couple things, housekeeping items throughout the webinar. We do want to encourage questions, so please use the Q&A function and I'll let our presenter know at the end. There is also the ability to raise your hand, and so I can unmute you at the end of the presentation. And lastly, there will be a survey that pops up following the webinar. If you please take a moment to provide feedback, it'll continue to help us improve on these webinars. So today's presenter is Hope Medina, and Hope is an energy and sustainability consultant for Shums Coda. Hope has worked on a national level to develop, promote, and assist with adopting the energy and green codes. Hope is a governing member of the ICC Sustainability Membership Council, a consensus committee member, and a task group chair of the National Green Building Standard and has been for several code cycles. So with that, Hope, I'll let you take it from here and I'll stop sharing my screen.
All righty, let's see here. Perfect. Are you able to see my screen?
Yep, looks great.
Wonderful. So today we are going to discuss the various energy compliance paths and to find out what really our options are when it comes to the compliance path. Now, I have to admit that I thought long and hard about how I wanted to present this information so that it was more readily understandable and hopefully really usable for everyone. So I didn't have an option. I did have an option, but I didn't have an opportunity to actually send out a poll to Erica. So I was hoping that I could get a good idea of what edition of the code you are currently on. So if you wouldn't mind typing in what code you are on as far as the energy code, that would be fantastic. And oh, wonderful. It looks like we are significantly 15, 18, and we do have 21 on here. So that's wonderful. So what I have here on this particular webinar is I broke up the compliance paths as far as what you would find from the 15, 18, and 2021, because there are some very somewhat small nuances that are with it, and some that addressed issues on how you were going to do this. Oops, there we go. So often when you start talking about what energy compliance path are you utilizing for this project, I think in many minds, you have this very complicated, twisted, get lost type of maze as far as how do you make your way through demonstrating compliance for whichever path that you so choose for that. And I'm hoping that by the end of this particular webinar, you'll kind of feel like what you're looking at isn't necessarily this, but you're more looking at this type of a deal where you're getting your first step in being able to reach that. So let's talk a little bit about the various compliance paths that are listed. And so on the commercial side of things, whether you're talking about 15, 18, or the 21, you have three very specific paths that are presented to you. You have prescriptive, you have total building performance, and then you have the option of utilizing the standard of ASHRAE 90.1. Now, if you do choose to utilize ASHRAE 90.1, you're going to want to make sure that you check in the reference section, which is typically chapter 6 in the code books, and it'll tell you what edition of the 90.1 is compatible with what you have currently adopted. Now, when we look at the residential side of the paths that are available, we have prescriptive, simulated performance alternative, and then we have the energy rating index, or what is commonly referred to as the ERI path. Now, you'll notice that I have an arrow there for those of you that are on the 2015 and the 2018. It's listed as the simulated performance alternative, but for the 21, that title was converted to the total building performance. Now, the content of it and the concept of it didn't change per se, like it's not just an overhaul and a new system. What it is they changed the title of it. And so now, if you notice, both on the commercial side and the residential side, they have a performance path, and both of these performance paths are called total building performance. So when we talk about prescriptive, prescriptive is actually not just one compliance path. It's a compliance path, but it provides you with three different options. And those three different options need to also be declared for you. Another thing to really keep in mind is when we start talking about compliance paths, the compliance path is not determined by the plans examiner or determined by the builder or determined by the inspector when they go out to do inspections. The intent is that the building has been designed to that. So the responsibility lies with the architect, the designer, even the engineer as determining and designing these projects for the particular compliance paths. So again, when we start talking prescriptive, commercially, there are three options that fall under the prescriptive path. You have your insulation component R value based method. You have your assembly U factor, C factor, or F factor method. And then you have your component performance alternative. Now that option didn't come in until the 2015, but it is available for everyone at the moment. Now let's talk about the residential prescriptive path. It also has the three options that are involved with it. You have your insulation and fenestration criteria, and That's one that I think everybody's very familiar with. And then your second option is called the U factor alternative. Now that is only available in the 2015 edition and the 2018 edition. In the 2021 edition, it is considered the RR value alternative. And I'll get into that a little bit further. So just know there is still only 3 options. And then of course you have your total UA alternative. Now, that's one of the things that's really great about the energy code is the fact that while you have things that you must comply with and you must do, it also really provides you with a whole lot of options and different various ways of getting to what that end goal is, which is, energy compliance. And so that's one of the things that these compliance paths, and specifically when we start talking, the prescriptive, is that you have these various options to get there. So on the commercial side, pretty much either commercial or residential, I want to talk about what these prescriptive options are, what really the concepts are involved for this, not specific requirements, but just the overall concept of what these options do. And this particular option is talking about the R value component concept. And what this does is where I think when we start talking like on the residential side, if you notice the table at the bottom of the screen, it's the table that everybody thinks about when you say, hey, you need to do an R20 in the walls. That's the concept that comes to your brain. It's the R values that you're going to find for the various building components, such as, your ceiling R values, your framed walls, whether they're above grade or below grade, what your slab edge insulation is going to be. And the same can be said when you talk about the commercial side of it, right? And so it's that table, the table that you look at, that if the insulation is going to be installed entirely above deck, you're looking at that column and it gives you that R value. And that's what this particular compliance path option is really about. Now, there is another option, whether you're commercial or residential, it's the same concept. And what it is, it's that assembly. And so it's referred to, on the commercial side, that's the U factor, C factor, F factor concept. And then you have the alternative on the residential side. And this concept is where you're taking the values of that entire assembly. So it's not just what insulation is being put in that cavity or what continuous insulation is going to be installed on those walls. It's everything involved with that. So that could be, the insulation, the drywall, the studs, the sheathing, and that's how you're able to get to the U factor numbers to be able to determine it. And so that's part of what this concept is. Now, here's an example of how you would look at this. So on the left-hand side of that sheet, it shows a wall assembly that has air film, plywood siding. It has a 1/2 inch of wood, 1 inch of insulating board, and then it has an R13 or for the wood studs. And then it has a 1/2 inch gypboard and then an air film. So you now know how that assembly has been established. How do you determine what those numbers are? And so if you look to the right, there are 2 columns, and these are going to give you what your R values are, but at different locations. It's going to give you an R value as to where that insulation cavity is. And then there's an R value of where that stud is. So for each of those rows in those columns, it's giving you the air film, whether it's at the cavity or at the stud, which is the 0.17. And then your plywood sheathing, at both the cavity and at the stud is still the the 0.59. your 1/2" sheathing, which is the 0.81. And then you have your insulating board, which is 3.57 at both columns. And this is where it's really going to change. And that's when we start talking about the insulation that's going into the cavity. So the cavity, obviously, it's putting in an R13 vat. So it's going to show that it has an R13 at the column that shows the R value for the insulation. Now, where that's at the stud, it's not going to have that full bad insulation. So it shows that it's at a 4.55. Now, you go to the gyp board, it's the 0.45, and then you have the air film, and then you have the totals. So at the bottom, you see that where the cavity is, you have an R value of 19.27. Now you have the R value at the stud, which is 10.82. Now, I think, maybe you do or maybe you don't. There's a lot of discussion about what your framing factor is. Typically, it's thought of at about an 80%, 20%. And what they're saying is that 80% of the wall is wood. Or I'm sorry, 20% of the wall is wood. And so what you're doing is you are adding up all those columns, and you're taking your R value at the insulation, which is the 19.27, and you're multiplying that by 80%, because that's where the cavity is. And then you're going to take that value and add it to the total for where the stud is and multiplying that by 20%. So basically you're taking the 15.41 plus the 2.16, and that's giving your average R value, which is 17.57. Now, to get a U factor out of the R value, what you're going to do is you're going to do where it's 1, and then you're going to divide it by whatever the R value is, and that's going to give you your U factor. And so this is just a very simple, brief explanation as far as how the assembly concepts work. Typically, you would find these particular values, I want to say, out of ASHRAE's Book of Fundamentals, and I believe it's Appendix G. Don't quote me on that. For some reason, I can't think of what it is right at this moment, but that's going to give you your values of the sheathing and the wood and the drywalls, so that you have valid data to be able to support where your numbers are coming from. So let's talk about the U factor, C factor, F factor, or what would be considered the U factor option, depending whether it's commercial or residential. It's the same basic concept to it. What you're doing is you're doing a twin building demonstration. You have the reference design for your thermal envelope, and that's going to be the prescriptive values for whichever edition of the energy code that you're on. So you're going to take those prescriptive values, and this is what the number is. Then what happens is you're inputting the information as far as what you want to install as far as the thermal envelope. Whether it's just the U factors of it, or you're using the C and F factors also for it, depending on if it's commercial or residential. And if it demonstrates that through these calculations that the proposed thermal envelope is equal to or less than the total UA for what you would find on the prescriptive house, then you would be considered that it would pass. So that's kind of the very, very basic concept of how this particular option works. Now, if this option is chosen, just know that your solar heat gain coefficient isn't included in the trade-off capabilities for the thermal envelope. You still have to meet what the minimum values or the maximum values are for that. So let's kind of dive into a little bit of what is expected as far as these particular paths. what you have to comply with, and what is really required for it. So in the insulation component R value method, and this is on the commercial side, with this particular path, you aren't having any trade-offs. There's no trading allowed. Everything is by the book. So you're following in this one, whether it's the 2015 or 2018, all the mandatory items, and then everything else that you're going to find within that. And for this one, there really isn't any specifically required reports. Now I say that because there isn't anything that calls out that says, oh, you must provide this if you're going with this particular prescriptive path. There are some reports and documentation that assists you with being able to demonstrate compliance, but it's not specifically called out as a requirement for this particular path. Now, for this path, you're going to comply with C402 through C405. And if you happen to be under the 2015 edition or the 2018 edition, you're also going to comply with C406, and you're going to choose an additional efficiency package option. Now, if you're under the 2021 edition of the IECC, you will be complying with C406, which is the additional efficiency, but it's no longer options. These are requirements. And that's probably a whole class in itself, but it does shift from choosing one option to obtaining so many points. And then you're going to also be complying with the commissioning provisions where it's going to fall in play for you. Not all the time is commissioning required for your mechanical systems, but commissioning is required for your lighting controls. Now for the commercial prescriptive path, that is your assembly U factor, C factor, or F factor method. Again, you're going to be having no trade-offs with it. It is by the book, and everything should be placed on your plans. But there is a little bit of documentation of or potential documentation that may be required, and that's documenting the values that were utilized when designing your particular assemblies. It's probably good practice that if a project is going to go with this particular direction, that if you're the architect or designer, that you would just submit them. And then as a plans examiner, you may ask for it because it's easier to be able to see how they came up with it. If you had a worksheet very similar to what I showed previously, it probably would help for that. If this path is chosen, you're going to comply with C402 through C405. You're also going to choose an additional efficiency package if you're the 2015 or 18. If you are the 2021, you're going to comply with the new C405 additional efficiency requirements. And again, you're going to comply with the commissioning as it sees fit for this particular project. I will say that while this isn't necessarily a highly used compliance path for new projects, because when it's new, it's probably a little bit easier to go with maybe some of the other compliance paths. And I'll say I've probably only seen maybe a handful of projects that have actually utilized this. Where I see maybe more of a possibility for this is when you start talking about like maybe remodels. I've seen where they've tried to utilize this path for that. So then for the commercial prescriptive path, you have the component performance alternative, as we are all very familiar with, which is ComCheck. Now, as I stated earlier, it wasn't until the 2015 that ComCheck actually was in the energy codes. Prior to that, on the commercial side of things, it was just one of those, I think, readily accepted alternate methods and material option that you didn't necessarily go through the process to say, hey, I'd like to use this. It just was readily accepted. but until the 15, it wasn't actually a true compliance path on the commercial side for the energy code, but glad it is, because it is very helpful. So for this particular path, it is again by the book, except for the fact that you do have the capability of trading off the components of the thermal envelope. Now it's only the thermal envelope. You aren't able to trade off anything beyond what was in that thermal envelope. And everything is placed on the plans, and whatever is placed on the plans should match the values that are in ComCheck. Because remember, you know, in 103.2, there's that table that says all these items are required to be placed on the plans. And that includes the insulation material, their value and thickness. And so that type of information should be readily available that's on the plans, and it should match what you see on that ComCheck. And then of course, with that being said, you're going to receive a ComCheck envelope compliance certificate. Now for this particular path, again, you're looking at that you're going to comply with C402.5. You're going to choose an additional efficiency package option if you're the 2015-2018, and the additional efficiency requirements that are found within 2021. You're also going to comply with whatever commissioning is going to be applicable to these particular projects. Okay. Now I'm going to do my best to not lose anybody as we talk about the prescriptive options that you're going to find when it comes to the residential path. The 2015 and 2018 IECC are they are the same in the sense that of what is in there is the same, not necessarily what the requirements are. So for the residential prescriptive compliance paths, you have the insulation and fenestration criteria, which is the, like I mentioned before, that table that when you start talking about, you know, what's required per your thermal envelope, this is the table that everybody thinks of and it pops in your head. It's almost a no-brainer. Everybody just knows the values that are in that. So this is R402.1.2. And then you have your U factor alternative, and that's R402.1.4, which is the table that you find here on the upper right hand of the screen. That shows you the U factor options, and all of those are the 0-point number situation. And then of course you have your total UA alternative, which is ResCheck. Now, let's talk a little bit about the 2021. The 2021, the concepts per se didn't necessarily change. What happened is the table that we typically see first, which is the 402.1.2, which is our R value fenestration requirements per component. That's usually the first table that we find. And then the second table is our U factor and fenestration requirement. And that's the order that has been forever and a day. In the 2021, they flipped. So now the charging prescriptive compliance path is your U factor compliance path. And the reason for that is because, believe it or not, your R values and all the other compliance paths are based off of these particular values. And so it was determined that because this is where everything kind of begins and ends with, that they wanted to place it as the first option in the prescriptive compliance path. So now the U factor table and requirements are considered the insulation and fenestration criteria. And now the R402.1.3 is the R value alternative as opposed to the U factor alternative that it was previously to the 2021. And I hope I did not completely confuse everyone with it. The concepts didn't necessarily change. Like I said, they just changed the order that you're going to find them within the energy code. And then, of course, nothing changed as far as your total UA alternative res check. It's still in R402.1.5. So good old res check is there for us. So let's talk a little bit about some of the requirements that you're going to find when we start talking about the insulation and fenestration criteria requirements, if you're the 2015, 2018, or how that path is referred to in the 2021, which is our R value alternative, but the requirements are still the same. There is no trading with this particular, compliance path. It is by the book, and everything should be placed on those plans. And again, you're not really required to provide any specific reports for this particular compliance path. You can, there are, like I said before, there are things that you can submit, but there isn't anything very specific that you need for it. You're going to comply with R402 through R404 if you are the 2015 or the 2018 edition. If you are the 2021, you're going to comply with R402 through R404, but you're also going to have to comply with R408. And R408 is the additional efficiency package options that did come into the 2021 edition of the IECC. It's a lot of things that here in Colorado we're already doing. So don't get thrown off or maybe concerned about this new section of the code. It's very doable for us. So the next one is your U factor alternative for the 2015, 2018 edition, and what is being considered the insulation and fenestration criteria if you are the 2021. This is not a path that you can do any trade-offs. It is, again, by the book. You're going to put everything on the plans, but you are going to need to provide, or it's suggested that you provide the documentation of your assembly values. So again, with this path, just like with the previous one, you're going to comply with R402 through R404 if you're the 15 or the 18, and you're going to comply with R402 through 404 and 408 if you're the 2021. And then, of course, you have your total UA alternative, which is res check. It's by the book, except for the fact that you are allowed to trade off for the thermal envelope, except for slab edge insulation. I know in the past, slab edge insulation has been demonstrated that you can trade that off. In recent, I'd say maybe month, PNNL has been doing some work behind the scenes. It's never been an option within the energy code that the slab edge insulation can be traded off. It's a requirement. And so now it doesn't matter what edition you go in to utilize as far as res check, you are no longer permitted to be able to trade off that slab edge insulation. So just an FYI, it's a very recent, I guess, entail that has happened with the res check. And if you have further questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Gil. Gil has been in direct communication with them about this particular item. So with this, and really with all of these prescriptive paths, everything that you see on the plans should match your res check, but also should match the values that you're going to find in Manual J. Often I find that the Manual J doesn't match those items, and that's just because whoever did the Manual J, they were there at the very beginning, and then the changes just haven't been passed along to them. And then, of course, you have the res check compliance certificate that you're going to want to provide. And again, you're complying with R402 through 404 if you're 15 or 18, and 402 and 404, and also 408 if you are 2021. Now let's talk about a different compliance path, our second true compliance path option that you find within the energy code. And that is the total building performance if you're commercial, and depending on what edition of the energy code that you're on for residential, it's either the simulated performance alternative or you are also the total building performance path. So this particular path is the option, or provides you the methodology to be able to do a whole building or a whole house performance and be able to trade off something. So that's going to include not just your thermal envelope, but other components as far as what's involved with that. So you're doing, again, one of those twin building concepts. You're going to have what's considered the reference design building, whether that's your house or building, and then what you're proposing to be designed. The tables are going to be able to determine what you can and cannot trade off in this design. And then when everything is said and done and all the calculations are determined, it's the annual energy cost that's going to determine whether or not this project will comply with the energy code. So if we talk about the commercial aspect of the total building performance, that annual energy cost documentation report that they should be providing you, it needs to show that it is equal to or less than 85% of what the annual energy cost for that reference design. You're also going to utilize tables C407.5.1 if you're 2015 or 2018. And for the 2021, you're going to utilize C407.4.1. Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky. If you're the 15 or 18, you're very familiar with the fact of sections that are listed as mandatory. You'll have the little section, it has the parentheses, and it says mandatory. All of those are required to comply with, even when you're going with this particular compliance path. Now, if you are in the 2021, there is no more mandatory and prescriptive sections. Everything is considered quote unquote mandatory. But there is a table that lists all the items that are sections that were previously considered and designated as mandatory. So now, instead of going through all of the code and trying to find all the sections that are listed as mandatory, there's this nice, neat table at the very beginning of this particular section that says, hey, you have to comply with these particular items. It's great. I'm so glad it finally got into the code. Now, the other thing that's going to be provided for this is you need to provide a compliance report that is submitted at permit application. And in that, it's going to demonstrate that the building, as it's been designed, will have that annual energy cost that's less than the 85%. Now, the software that's utilized for this particular compliance path needs to comply with the particular requirements of C407.6 or C407.5, depending on what edition you are on. And then this project, again, depending on what's being installed and what's being utilized, you would comply with the commissioning aspect of it. Now let's talk about the residential side of the performance compliance path. This particular path, you are going to, again, provide that annual energy cost for it. But for this time, it only has to equal or be less than what the annual energy cost of the reference design. A little bit different than what you see on the commercial side. That was where it had to be 85% of it. This one just says equal to or less. You're going to be utilizing various tables. If you are the 2015-18, you're going to use 405.5.2. And if you're 2021, 405.4.2, which is what you see on the right-hand side of the screen. It's just an expert of a section of the table. There's much more that's involved as far as how it's designed. And so as you can see here, it gives you kind of the parameters of what's behind the scene there. You have your standard reference design. So it's telling you that this is what you're going to input for your standard reference design. You know, it's going to be, you know, a mass wall, or you can use the wood frame. You're going to put whatever the gross area is, whatever the U factor is, solar admittance. And then for your proposed design building, you're going to input what is proposed to be installed. Now, in that column, it may have other sections that say as reference design. And if it says that in the proposed design, that means that that isn't something that is tradable through this compliance path. Now, for this particular compliance path, you again have to do the mandatory or the utilize the table if you're in the 2021. But for this particular path on the residential side, it requires 2 different reports to be submitted. You have the report that's submitted for permit, and on this one, it talks about what is listed on the plans. And so the report will say like per plans. That's a pretty typical phrase that will be utilized. And on that, again, it should show all the specific information that calls out within the section, because there are requirements of what has to be listed in this report. And then it has to show that it has an annual energy cost that is equal to or less than the reference design. And then a second report needs to be submitted for these particular projects. And this particular report is going to say what was actually installed in the building. So as we all know, the plans show the perfect world where everything is going to be as such. And then you go out in the field in the real world and you couldn't get this particular equipment. So you're utilizing this equipment. Maybe it's better, maybe it's not, whatever the case may be. But the second report actually documents and says what was actually put into the building, which is very important because then you know what really went into the building. But that report will say something like field verified or inspected verified, something along those lines. And that's how you can determine the difference between the 2 reports. Again, this particular compliance path has requirements as far as the type of software that can be utilized. And in the later editions, it talks about specific standards that it has to meet. And then if you're in the 2021 edition of this, you are required to comply with the additional efficiency packages. So we're hitting the home stretch here. We're on this last one. So as far as commercial goes, the very last option that you have is the ASHRAE 90.1. And as I said, you would go into chapter 6 to determine which edition of ASHRAE would be required for you. Now, it is not something that you can pick and choose, you know, do IECC for the thermal envelope and then do mechanical out of 90.1. Whatever is chosen for the project, it's either all or nothing. So you either do everything to 90.1 or you utilize the IECC. So that is another option. Just so that you are aware, ASHRAE has a whole plethora of compliance paths that are options within ASHRAE itself. So not only on the commercial side do you have basically the three compliance paths with the options in the prescriptive path, you also have additional compliance path options that you can find within ASHRAE 90.1. So with it, when everything is said and done, a designer should be able to find something that's going to be real comparable and you know, highly usable for whatever project that they're going to be working on. And often the reason why you would utilize 90.1 is because, you know, it's very, very useful when you have like a really intense mechanical system. Often mechanical engineers prefer to utilize, you know, ASHRAE 90.1 over IECC because it does, you know, take into account certain items and aspects. So that has been, you know, really the case, you know, in the past. But again, all or nothing. And when you are getting reports for ASHRAE, there are various reports. ComCheck does have a component that utilizes ASHRAE 90.1. So just make sure any documents that shows that information says ASHRAE 90.1 all throughout all the documents. So let's talk about the last one for energy, as I know we're getting very close to the end here. The newest, I would say, addition to the compliance path is the Energy Rating Index, and that's commonly known as the ERI path. I think many times it's referred to as the HERS rating. And while HERS is often utilized maybe for some of this, ICC is very cognitive about the fact of making sure that what gets put in is somewhat of a non-proprietary component of it. So this is why it's listed as the generic term of the Energy Rating Index and not a HERS score or a HERS rating. But this concept is, again, utilizing that geometric twin where your quote unquote design referenced home, you're utilizing the prescriptive values of the 2006 IECC. And then for your proposed values, you're utilizing what you want with some requirements that have to be in there. And you're demonstrating compliance by numbers. This is a compliance by number situation. And that number is demonstrating how much of a percentage you're better than if this had been done to the 2006 prescriptive value. So that's why there's the number component of it. So if you are the 15 or 18 component, you're going to comply with the mandatory provisions that you find through R401 through R404. You're also going to comply with the requirements of table R406.4, and you are going to need to provide a compliance report for this. Now, it is required that this is verified by an approved third party, and I do emphasize approved third party. And then there again are requirements as far as the software tools that can be utilized to demonstrate this. Now, if you're the 2015 edition, this is table R406.4 that you are going to need to comply with. So the Energy Rating Index number that you see there is the maximum number you can have. So if you happen to be climate zone 6 and you receive a 53, you are good to go because you are even better than what the maximum number is within this table. Now, if you are the 2018, if you notice, take a look at the numbers there, and the numbers here, those numbers increased from the 15 to the 18. And you say, hey, Hope, that seems really odd. Why would they increase when typically, things kind of get, for lack of a better word, ratcheted down? And part of that is because in the 15, it was a brand new compliance path. So you have to start somewhere. You have your jumping off point. And so they were saying that at that point in time, it was very difficult to be able to get to those numbers without including solar into it. And so that was heed, and people took note of it. For the 2018, they increased the numbers. And as a compromise, what they did is they added footnote A. And what footnote A says that, okay, great, you have to get to these numbers, but to get to these numbers, if you utilized on-site renewable energy to be able to get to this number, now there are some requirements. And those requirements is that your thermal envelope cannot be less than the value of what you would find for the 2015 IECC. So those thermal envelope values can't be less than what you would find in the 15. And then of course your solar heat gain coefficient cannot be greater than that either. Now, in the 2021, because this whole thing continued as far as renewable energy and not renewable energy and all the issues that kind of manifested around that, Again, everybody came to the table and they kind of came up with some very, very interesting solutions. And I hope you all think of them as solutions as far as this particular option here. Now, so for this particular compliance path, just like on the performance, they created a table that tells you what are the sections are that previously were listed as mandatory. It's a great thing. And then they added this new component. So you have an equation that will be utilized if you are utilizing on-site renewable energy as part of getting to your number. And then you will utilize something completely different if you did not include renewable energy into your number. You're also going to comply with the values that you find in table R406.5. And now this time around, it's required that you provide 2 compliance reports, one that's based on for submittal, for your plan submittal, for your permit submittal, and then an actual report for CO. Now, another component that came into it is a renewable energy certificate or RECs. So if you utilize RECs to get to your numbers, you now have to disclose that information. So if you are utilizing or not utilizing on-site renewable energy to get to your number, you're going to be utilizing this equation. And that is, here is what your proposed design, and it has to, or it equals 1.15 of your UA prescriptive reference design. So it kind of gives you somewhat of a break in trying to be able to get to those numbers. Now, the other option is if you are utilizing on-site renewable energy, to be able to get to your numbers, you are going to have anything that's equal to or greater than as far as your thermal envelope when it comes to, and that comes out of the 2018 IECC. So these are the numbers that you see here on the screen. And with that, you should be able to accomplish and get to these numbers. And as you can see here, these are the 2021 numbers, and they're more in line with what you saw towards the 2015, with acknowledging the fact that there is the on-site renewable energy concept that's coming up on all of that. So I would be remiss to not talk about above code programs. It does have an option in here within the energy code that says you can utilize above code programs. They have to be approved, and that you still have to do what is considered as the mandatory items that you find in chapter 4, or utilize the mandatory table. And there's a lot of above code programs that are out there. I just caution you when you start accepting these or looking at them, you might want to take a look, because not all of them are created equal. Some of them work with the energy code, the IECC, they understand, they build off of it. And then others do not. Some of them, go back to like 2009. So just keep that in mind. But an above code program is still, in my opinion, considered as another option for energy compliance path. So with that, do we have any questions? And if you think of questions afterwards, we have this great new tool that's available. It's the Colorado Codes Helpline, as Erica had mentioned previously. So if you have a question and you're dying to get an answer to, remember for this, this is one of the things that's really nice, is the fact that while we're able to provide, any type of information and answer questions when it comes to energy, this helpline also has the opportunity that you can ask questions through other codes too. So keep that in mind, reach out. We'd love to see you asking us questions through our coloradocodes.happyfox.com/new. We'd love to see those questions come in so we can fill up our inboxes with lots of fun. So with that, here's my contact information if you have any questions.
Thanks, Hope. Yeah, and just one thing to add is that, the helpline this is our first year. This is our pilot year. So we'll be using a lot of the questions that you submit to create resources, create commonly asked FAQs, all those kinds of things. So submit any question, no question is too small. We're here as a resource for you all. So with that, Hope, we do have a few questions.
Okay.
The Q&A and the chat. So the first one that we received earlier on is how to deal with energy rating of a new pop top on a historic uninsulated brick bungalow.
That is an excellent question. And with that, and I'm guessing, Doug, I'm hoping that you are either on the 15, 18 or 21 edition of the IECC. And the reason I say that is because from the 15 edition on, there was this great new addition to the Energy Code, which was Chapter 5. And Chapter 5 deals with how do you address existing buildings? And with that, it also, oh yes, 2018. So you do have the Chapter 5 with it. And so in that particular item, you can do, it would probably fall under addition, but there are requirements in there when it comes to historic. So take a look at the section of historic. It may fall under that there may be certain components because they are trying to keep in line with the historic fabric of the building. Maybe they aren't able to fully comply with the Energy Code here, but they can comply with the Energy Code here. Now, with it being an addition, it basically, all the addition would typically comply as if it was a new building. So my suggestion would be to take a look at Chapter 5 and specifically take a look at the historic section and see if there are components of it that it may not comply with. I hope that answers your question, Doug.
Thanks, Hope. All right, another question teed up for you here. With the adoption of Appendix RC for new homes, could a rater use Section R406.4? I have a rater stating it is difficult to get to an ERI of 47 and nearly impossible to get to an ERI of 0. And there's a follow-up question as well on Appendix RC. Do you have to use the ResNet ICC for the energy rating index, or are you allowed to use HERS rating?
Well, you bring up a very good point that I should have mentioned, is the fact that when we talk about HERS and ERI numbers, they are different because unfortunately they have diverged from it. So, and I'm sorry, I'm going to probably mix it up. If it's an ERI score, it's better than what you would find on out of the IECC, or it's vice versa. And I apologize again, I can't remember what it is, but you have to look at the document and they have to specifically utilize the components for the ERI path and not necessarily for the HERS. And as far as the components that you mentioned as far as the ERI path and the Appendix RC, which Appendix RC is the appendix that was established for zero energy residential buildings. And it was based off of the energy rating index score. So I guess, are you asking that they either utilize what you would find in the appendix or utilize utilize the appendix or utilize 406? Because typically what you would do is you would follow what is found in Appendix RC as opposed to 406. I hope that answers it. I'm not sure who that was. Oh, they want to use ASHRAE 6. No, they would utilize Appendix RC, if I remember correctly on that. Let me look into that and I will get back to you, Chad.
Great, thank you, Hope. A couple more questions. So we'll keep moving. Our code official was asked to approve of software used for the modeling of a proposed SFR under the Passive House Planning Package, which is the state-of-the-art energy modeling of very high performance buildings and is validated according to the ASHRAE standard 140. This appears as applicable to commercial buildings. What does Hope think about approval?
You know what, without actually seeing it, I don't know that I would necessarily venture a guess, other than the fact that many of the softwares actually have to comply with ASHRAE standard 140. So if this particular modeling stated and demonstrated that it met that standard, I don't know that I would necessarily have an issue with it.
All right, one more question.
Okay.
Talk about commercial building envelope air tightness when testing applies in the 2021 code.
Okay, so this is almost an entire webinar itself, so I'm going to give you the very cliff note versions. In the 2021, it did become a requirement under certain sizes and certain occupations, occupancies, that thermal envelope testing, basically blower door testing, is going to be required. And not only that, if it's not required, then you will be required to do, basically, it's called, thermal envelope verification, but it's basically a thermal envelope commissioning component where, a third party is going to review all of that. But that is kind of it in a nutshell, is the fact that it's here.
The language is a little confusing the way it's written. And I think that they're working to clarify that maybe in the next code cycle. I know that Denver's been specifically working on that to make it a little bit more clear in terms of what the requirement is, but they're going to maintain a 0.4 CFM per square foot threshold. So if you get from 0.4 CFM per square foot up to 0.6, there's some remediation that needs to be done in order to get under the threshold, and then above 0.6, you fail the test. So we're still working with Denver specifically to sort out what that means as well. So
yeah, and that's and you're right, it is, that section is new and it is confusing. And the reason I think where the confusion kind of separate proposals that were approved. I was interested in how they were going to correlate these three code proposals to incorporate into this one new section. I do know, from my understanding, is there is some discussion happening. I think I can say that on the consensus committee side. Let's just say there is some awareness of the fact that, we all knew that there was probably something that was going to happen in that area, just because when you're combining three different proposals to make one section, while they complemented each other, they also had very distinct points in it. And I know it sounds horrible when you read it, but it's actually a good culmination of the three code proposals. It's not perfect, but for what was there, it's pretty darn good.
Takes a village sometimes.
Yeah, it does.
We've got a couple more questions.
Okay,
I hope if you've got the time.
I have the time.
Perfect. We've got where can we confirm an R value for a log wall with logs varying from 14 inches to 18 inches? Isn't there a log wall or log home standard? Am I remembering that correctly?
You are. It is ICC 400. And with it, it will give you what the R value is for various diameters of log, but it's not necessarily just the diameter. There's a little bit more involved with it, but it does give you at least some good jumping off point for it. So check out ICC 400. I can't remember if it's available through the digital codes or not, but I'm sure there are people around who have access to it. So.
Yeah, and if you have a specific question, Heather, like that, you can also submit it to the helpline, and if it's not accessible, and we can get Hope to look it up, or one of the other subject matter experts. So
sounds good. Let's get that hotline going.
All right, last question.
Okay.
Is for an addition or remodel of a residence. If you could not meet the prescriptive minimum ceiling component R value, how would you approach the alternative pathways 2015, 2018, and 2021?
My thought process when we start talking about existing buildings is, if it happens to be an addition, you're starting from scratch. And so in theory, you really should be able to basically, to an extent, fully implement the minimum requirements that are going to be found within the code, with maybe some very small exceptions for that. Now, when we start talking about like remodels, my philosophy is, there are some things within the code, such as if you remove the drywall and that cavity is filled with insulation, whether it's an R13 or an R243, it would be deemed to comply. When you start talking about maybe ceiling components, maybe it either had no insulation or it had an R13 or R20, something along those lines. And now they're wanting to improve it, and all they can get in there is an R30. My thought is, if we are improving upon what is already existing, you're getting more energy compliance than what it was a week ago. And so would I love for it to be 100%? Absolutely. But the reality is you aren't going to get that. So if you can get little strides of improvement each time there is a remodel, I say that that's a win for every jurisdiction.
Great. Well, that's all the questions that we have today. Thank you again, Hope, for a great presentation, and thank you everyone for attending. And we will have our next webinar in January. So I hope to see you then.
Thank you, Erica. Thanks, everyone.